by the power invested in me by this group and Patrick, who could not make it, I will present to you the update of Work Group 3. I will start with a reminder. Basically, we're in the second stage. Our final goal is that of providing a set of standardized indicators and methodological protocols in order to be able to analyze data sets, but also inspire other surveys on ethnic minorities and migrant groups. The first step that we have completed so far was to build a grid of domains that ideally would provide us with a far more comprehensive picture of the integration process. The second step that we just begun is that to identify relevant indicators for each of the subdimensions of the grid. And once we achieve this goal, the idea is that the work will be taken over by Work Groups 1 and Work Group 2 in order to identify the existence of questions related to said indicators. So we might want a certain indicator, but as it turns out, in none of the surveys for which we have collected metadata, a relevant question exists. Now, in the third step, we are hoping to provide a framework of the potential and the limits of these indicators, the conditions of use, and the context of validity. All right. An important reminder is that the type of indicators, integration indicators that we are interested in is indicators from quantitative survey data. So data similar to the one for which metadata was collected. Now, in relation to the grid, after much debate, we came up with a list of 15 areas of integration, and these are the areas 3 by 5. Now, what you see in red is work groups or mini work groups for which we have sufficient people. I remind you that Work Group 3 is the most populated work group in our action. I also remind you that a lot of you registered as experts in one of these 15 areas, and despite this being the case, in the category of leisure, education, language, and social ties, there is one person, only one person who volunteered to do the work. In the case of social tie, that person is Laura. So, it is...
And I have plenty to do.
No need to say that, but I will repeat it. So, yes, it is unfair for Laura to do all the work of social ties. It is also unfair for Mare to do all the work of leisure. And on education, currently we're operating with 2 temporary volunteers. So actually, apparently there's no expert on education in this room. And there is also no expert on language. This can only be my conclusion. So, moving on. In those groups where we had sufficient volunteers, I requested for a democratic vote of a point person. The point person has no other job to do than answer my email on an update of the status of work. In green, you see the groups that currently do not have a point person. So, more groups added. And finally, in terms of progress, you are now seeing in orange the groups that so far managed to establish communication, organize a Skype conversation, and send me some sort of material, some sort of grid. Yes. Education, though operating on 2 temporary volunteers, achieved that. All right, Before I move forward, I'm going to show you and remind you the groups in case some of you are considering volunteering. So, labor market one, I am the point person. In health, we don't have a point person, nor have I achieved to contact the 2 people that volunteered. Have not heard from them. Education, 2 people. Religion, 3. I have sent this email last week asking for volunteers. I sent also the guidelines and the list. And I received no answer. So maybe by shaming you in public. That will work. All right? I will send again after this presentation the list. And I will spam you until I have at least 3 people in one category. Okay? All right. Enough shaming. Now, guidelines. I also sent them in the past 2 weeks, at least 4 times. I send them to the people in the mini groups. I also send them to the entire work group 3 along with my call for volunteers. In case you have not seen said guidelines, I am happy to send them to you personally. I'm going to send them once more today after the presentation, and I will briefly go through them once more now. All right, so the idea is that we came up with those 15 categories for the indicators, and then we decided that indicators can fall in one or multiple of these 3 categories, namely context, indicators referring to context, indicators referring to an input, and indicators referring to an outcome. Remember that these are indicators that should speak to both migrant groups but also to ethnic groups. And when I say migrant, I say both first generation and second generation. So, with respect to context, indicators can refer conditions of access to various types of resources, benefits, facilities. They can also refer recognition of rights and achievement. And last but not least, a certain benchmark level. When I refer to a benchmark level, I'm not referring to information that is derived from censuses or statistics office. It's a benchmark level that can be calculated from the survey data that you have. Input indicators refer to those achievements, practices, positions, or lack thereof of the responder prior to migration, in the case of first-generation migrants, of family members, in the case of higher-generation migrants or ethnic minorities, that might affect the current integration process. And outcomes refers to achievements, practices, positions, or lack thereof of the respondent in either of the before-mentioned categories associated with the integration process. Now, 2 further notes were made. The first one had to do with the fact that in the case of certain indicators, you would have to consider group-specific characteristics. So you might have to come up with indicators tailored on account of socio-demographic aspects. So we have, and I give multiple more examples in the guidelines. Here I only took 2. One was for gender, and I said think gender behavior. So for example, when you have an indicator for religious practice and wearing and religious wear, things might be different for men and women, say, in the Muslim group. In the case of age, you might want to have different indicators when it comes to youth political engagement as opposed to when you are referring the adult population. lastly, when you're thinking of indicators, you should also take into account the fact that you might have different levels of measurement. So you might have, in the case of attitudinal indicators, you might have in-group and out-group relations. So indicators might refer to that. And you might also look at who the reference group is when it comes to the measurement of an indicator. Okay, so are you referring to the attitudes of the native population towards the Muslims, or looking at Muslims as opposed to Latinos, minority to minority, and non-majority to minority? And we gave two examples, okay? First was the case of health, and we took as an indicator access to healthcare from a legal perspective. So this particular indicator can belong to two sub-dimensions, to both context and input. This is the format of the indicator, whether the person has access to healthcare in the host country, in the home country, host country for context, home country for input, and whether the indicator is sensible to a certain socio-demographic. In this particular case, is not applicable. And then we also have in the guidelines the case of religion, and I will focus on this one. So indicators of religious practice, a more precisely display or wear of religious symbols. Okay? One indicator would be the presence. No, this was forgotten. So the display of such wear, and then further disaggregated by gender. Okay? We said that if the groups feel that there is too much work and the group is too small of 2 people, one suggestion was to begin by listing the indicators and then working backwards towards dividing into the sub-dimensions. But this as a shortcut only if you feel overwhelmed by the amount of work. Okay? In the mini groups, you are free to work as you consider, so you might want to work with an Excel spreadsheet, or you might want to work in Word. It is up to you. What I care about is a final document, and then I'll piece it all together. In terms of getting organized, as discussed with Patrick, we need more volunteers. Now, the deadline that we agreed upon in Luxembourg was March 20. Given how things are staying are at this moment, we do not believe that this is still feasible. We would like to believe, but I understand there is our H 2020 projects to be finished, so on and so forth. And we have a suggestion. We don't know whether it is feasible financially.
Financially, yes. I'm not sure whether it's feasible travel restrictions wise.
And if it's feasible also travel restriction wise,
I would suggest not limiting to the end of April, but hopefully.
Yeah, we were thinking end of April, but yeah, maybe May. But then we're looking into the new financial year.
We don't know whether the action will exist in May. We honestly don't know, given the current situation. So we will discuss that.
I opened the can of worms.
No, I mean very practically, if we can't travel, then I'm not sure how we can have an action. But that's it. Like I generally don't know.
Yeah. So operating under the assumption that we still exist. The idea was to organize a Thursday, Friday type of, or half Thursday afternoon, Friday event at INED involving just the experts that are are putting work into this to iron out the details of the Greek. And this is the end of my glorious presentation.